Hello and welcome to Equity and Public Spaces Explained, our third of 5 live explainers celebrating Yale Earth Week 2021. Based on our Yale Experts Explain written article series, the purpose of these explainers is really to break down complex hot topics in sustainability using Yale's world-class expertise, thereby inviting everyone in the Yale community into conversations around climate change and how it affects them. Today we'll have Yale College student Marie Sanford interviewing Chris Perkins, a joint degree MEM and MBA student at the Yale School of the Environment and the Yale School of Management. We'll get started in just a moment. At the end of the conversation, if we have some time, we'll answer audience questions. So feel free to pop all of your questions into the Q&A section of your screen. And if you have any tech questions, feel free to add them in the chat and we'll help you out. Without any further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to our incredible student interviewer, Marie, for Equity and Public Spaces Explained.
Hi, everyone. I'm super excited to have this conversation today. I'm a sophomore in Yale College, in Saybrook College, and I'm an English major. When I'm not working at the Office of Sustainability, I write for the Yale Daily News magazine, and I'm also active in a couple of dance groups on campus. Before we get started and I introduce Chris, our lovely expert today, I'm going to read our inclusion statement, which is super pertinent to our conversation today about public lands. So the Yale Office of Sustainability recognizes that generations of Indigenous peoples and nations have stewarded the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and the land on which Yale's campus resides. We recognize that Indigenous values actively connect to our work, and we seek to learn more about those connections. We understand that the process will be ongoing, and we look forward to opportunities for collaboration. We ask that all participants consider their role in putting us on the pathway to right the wrongs of forced occupancy of lands and subjugation of others. Please find our full land acknowledgement in the chat and learn more about the numerous Indigenous communities that have stewarded Connecticut's land. And in the spirit of inclusion, we would also like to ask the audience that live explainers are a neutral and safe space for asking questions and testing ideas. Be open, listen honestly, and act mindfully. And without further ado, I will let Chris introduce himself.
Thanks, Marie. My name is Chris Perkins. I'm a joint degree student in my final semester between the School of the Environment and the School of Management. I use he, him pronouns. I'm from Seattle, Washington, currently calling in today from Victor, Idaho, where I am putting down roots with my wife, and it feels really good. My focus at the school has generally been on the future of outdoor recreation and conservation and the intersections between those two fields. So this is a very topical conversation that I'm really looking forward to having with Marie today. So super fun to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. So we can just get started with the first general question. So when we're talking about the outdoors or public lands, what does that refer to? And how do we define outdoor recreation?
Oh, such a great question. And I'm going to share some slides here. Okay. So Marie, I can give you a quick answer and a much longer answer. And I think we have time for both. So the quick answer is that outdoor recreation today comprises all the activities one might do for leisure in an outdoor setting. Things like walking or biking or wheelchairing on a trail or climbing, fishing, skiing, boating, hunting, sitting, painting, photography, so many other things. And these things are like so fun and they make us feel really good. And when I think about my own life, like this is my family. I grew up in a family that had a lot of meaningful experiences outside throughout my upbringing. This is me when I was like probably 5 years old on the Salmon River. I can assure you that I was doing nothing to steer this boat, but I felt pretty cool in the process. And this is like a big part of my family's culture is spending time outside. And it feels really restorative and a place where we build community in all sorts of ways. This is a favorite photo of a fox I took in Japan. So I love outdoor recreation. Before I go on, do you, Marie, have a favorite type of outdoor recreation? anywhere on that spectrum from sitting to skydiving or something like that?
Not skydiving. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, and during the pandemic, my mom and I actually got more into going more north, and Georgia has a lot of federal parks and state parks that are really beautiful for trail hiking, and they're typically on lakes, so that's been fun. I have not done like the snow activities though, being from the South.
Well, maybe sometime we'll hang out and you can do some mentorship.
Yes.
You also asked about public lands, and again, quick short answer, public lands generally refer to public spaces set aside for the benefit of the people. And here we have a map of federal public lands. So this is like 640 million acres, mostly in the West. But I'll point out there are also state and local parks that enable public access, like East Rock Park in New Haven. And although I'm not in New Haven currently, when I lived there, I would go to East Rock Park most days. I love that park for hiking or sitting or trail running. And like all public lands, anyone is allowed to use it. At least there is no discrimination by law. But we live in this time where not all people view outdoor recreation and public lands in the same way. And this is where the long answer comes in. If you spend any time on social media, you'll read countless anecdotes from folks of color or disabled people or indigenous people or the LGBT places that for someone like me feel very restorative, but for folks like those don't always feel welcoming or safe or restorative. And I think to explain why this is on a bigger scale, we might have to go like way back, like to the arrival of colonists at Jamestown. Is that cool?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
All right. So I think the attitudes of these first settlers had a bigger role in shaping our view of nature, lands, and achievement than we might realize. So first of all, who was on North America? Well, estimates ranged anywhere from 7 million to 18 million people lived in North America. Archaeological data indicates that humans were in this hemisphere as far back as 20,000 years ago, organized into sovereign tribes or nations with diverse traditions, distinct leadership systems, and very sophisticated ways to live in harmony with the land. And who was arriving? Well, in the late 15th century, the Europeans wanted more efficient trade routes. And as we know, on one of these expeditions, Christopher Columbus accidentally landed in the Caribbean, which marked the beginning of colonization as we know it. And a really important piece of history here is that the European powers were operating under this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery, which was authorized by the Pope. And this doctrine, which I can't claim to read here, claimed that European countries could seize lands occupied by indigenous people who were not subjects of a European monarch. And I point this out to note, like, this is the feeling, the prerogative that these folks were arriving to these lands with. Here they arrive in this new unknown place that has people who look different from them, with a mandate to take new lands and resources for the benefit of European powers. And so this is when indigenous removal begins. By the 1600s, when colonists arrived to the modern day United States, they bring with them this tradition of private land ownership, which is not a concept for indigenous people. For the new colonists, undeveloped land was viewed as wild and in need of cultivation and development. And I'll point out that the colonists were not using terms like outdoor recreation, but I think you're starting to see where this is headed. The outdoors historically has been framed as this wild unknown and initially a place to conquer, like the wilderness. And there's this author named William Cronin who wrote an essay called The Trouble with Wilderness. And he points out that in the 1800s, the word wilderness in the English dictionary was accompanied by terms like deserted and savage and desolate and barren. And in the 1800s, this perception persisted, but then you have the rise of transcendentalists like Henry David Thoreau, who start to frame nature in this new way, as a cathedral, as a home of the sublime, as a place for restoration of character, but only for a very specific type of person. We know these benefits were not extended to all communities. In the mid 1800s, as Thoreau is climbing Mount Katahdin in Maine for leisure to feel the immense power of nature, the transatlantic slave trade is at its peak. And African Americans' relationship to land is one of hard labor and brutal conditions, this intergenerational physical and psychological trauma, where in that context, the forest is both a place of escape where one can evade slave catchers, but it's also a place where one's brothers and sisters can be lynched. And that's very confusing. How do you look at the forest when there's so many mixed meanings there? At the same time, indigenous people are being forcibly removed from their lands left and right. So Congress has the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. In the early 1800s, the Supreme Court affirms the status of tribes as sovereign nations. So as the United States starts expanding west, the British and US governments are entering into treaties with tribal governments. And many of these treaties are broken almost right away. And as the US government takes over this land, it dissolves the cultural underpinning for these tribes because land is their kin and the land is being taken away. And people moving west are motivated by this idea of manifest destiny, in which American people and institutions have special virtues, and we will take on the frontier and shape the frontier to our wishes with the backing of God. And it's during this time that we start to see the first precursors to the public lands that we enjoy today. So in 1864, President Lincoln sets aside Yosemite Valley in the upper left there. He sets it aside for the state of California as a public park, in the process displacing the Southern Sierra Miwok tribe. We also have Yellowstone National Park, not far from where I am now, established by President Grant in 1872 as the first national park. And this is the ancestral home of the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Bannock, and the Shoshone tribes. And in the early 1900s, today's public land management agencies take shape. So this is like the US Forest Service or the National Park Service or the Bureau of Land Management. And all these organizations have the purpose to utilize public lands for the benefit of the American people, whether through outdoor recreation or natural resource management like timber, oil and gas, and other minerals, and wildlife habitat protection. It's really post-World War II, actually, that we start to see this commercialization of outdoor recreation as an industry. And part of that is because new materials and fabrics are able to be utilized in gear and apparel. A great anecdote of this is like leftover metal from the creation of planes in World War II is used to build those classic silver canoes that you might see around. And during this time, recreation becomes this integral part of the expression of domesticity and gender roles, and things like camping and hunting and outdoor sports become these like core activities for like the classic middle-class American family. But remember that we're still in the Jim Crow South. In the 1920s, superintendents at Shenandoah National Park are quoted as saying, "We cannot openly discriminate against African Americans, but they should be told that the parks have no facilities for taking care of them." And Shenandoah National Park was segregated through this gentleman's agreement where they committed to operate the park according to the state of Virginia's local laws and customs, including segregation. Tribes are still being terminated through forced assimilation. Japanese Americans are being interned on sites that are on many of today's public lands. Today, tribes control 2% of the United States through reservations. And since landmark environmental legislation in the 1970s, we're in this modern era of environmentalism and public land management in which everyone by law is welcome. But with history like that I just described, it's no wonder that today's outdoor recreation is predominantly a white middle to upper class pursuit. And to illustrate this, this is a 2020 report from the Outdoor Foundation, which shows that, so looking at the graph on the right there, the outer circle represents the proportion of demographic groups in society. The inner circle represents the proportion of those groups that participate in outdoor recreation. And you'll see there that participation from African American and Black communities is 24% below their share of the population relatively. And participation from Hispanic communities is 35% below their share of the population. And in the graph at left, that just shows the in-group participation. So for example, 52% of Caucasian or white individuals participate in outdoor rec, whereas only 39.7% of African American and Black individuals participate. And the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that this is not coincidence. This is generation after generation after generation of trauma and exclusion to build the public lands that we have today that enable the experiences that someone like me enjoys so much, but come at significant cost. And the last thing I want to say, I know I've been talking for a while, Marie, but today we have what's known as the outdoor industry. And I work in the outdoor industry, and one such company is Patagonia. And I could be picking on any company here, but Patagonia is a real thought leader in the industry. And a couple of years ago, I just went through my email and I screenshotted just the imagery that was coming to me as a consumer. And this is what I saw. That's a baby. Also a baby. Marie, as you look at these photos, like what sort of story do you feel like this kind of imagery tells about what outdoor recreation is and who does it?
I think the pictures of the babies actually are like very telling to me, and sort of what you were saying about not even, I think in elementary school you might learn about manifest destiny, but you never learn about the prerogative that the initial colonizers came over with. And this notion of like, this is our right that we're literally born into is definitely still portrayed in these ads. And something I was really touched by, or like affected me, when you were talking about these protection agencies, there's a deep irony of setting aside lands for the American people, as though, which totally negates the communal kinship of land of the indigenous peoples. But then it also asks the question of who are the American people, which could be a whole nother conversation.
It really could.
I'm thinking about this idea of health and nature. So you talked about the transcendentalism movement a little bit, and you opened up with talking about how, because of this history, public lands are often unsafe or unhospitable to Hispanic people, Black people, LGBTQ communities. And so I'd like to unpack that like link between health and nature and how proximity or access to nature impacts health. And when I'm thinking about health, I'm also thinking about safety within that question, on both the personal level and the community level.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's one that's starting to be incorporated into virtually every healthcare system. And the context here is that decades of research supports the notion that parks and nature in general help improve physical and mental health. They nurture children, they help bring communities together. And these studies show that time in nature, provided that people feel safe, is a real antidote for stress. It can lower blood pressure and stress hormone levels. It can reduce nervous system arousal, enhance immune system function, increase self-esteem, reducing like all these things that make time outside fun, again, provided that it feels safe. And there's this great study from the University of Exeter. They looked at 20,000 people and found that people who spend at least 2 hours a week in green spaces, whether it's local parks or other natural environments, either all at once or spaced over several visits, are substantially more likely to report good health and psychological well-being than those who don't. And interestingly, 2 hours a week is a hard boundary. The study shows that there were no benefits for people that didn't meet that threshold. And these effects are cross-cutting over different occupations and ethnic groups and people from rich and poor areas, people with chronic illnesses and disabilities. And as someone who has led outdoor trips as a professional, this is me with co-instructors on a course for the National Outdoor Leadership School, I can really attest that time outside brings communities together. There's something about the peacefulness of time outside that promotes comfort. It provides space to gather. And in certain more challenging pursuits like hiking or backpacking or climbing, it really helps build trust amongst people through that shared temporary discomfort. And in an urban setting, parks bring people together who may not cross paths otherwise, which fosters this more community feel and it breeds civic engagement. And so to get back to your question about the nature and health intersection, it's an area of great research right now. Research institutes for nature and health are operating at major medical centers, and some electronic health record systems have begun to incorporate nature prescriptions, just like pharmacological ones. And these prescriptions could take many forms, from general encouragement to get outside at least twice a week, all the way to like specific instructions. I think you should go to the White Blaze Trail at East Rock Park for a brisk walk for 1 hour a day, 3 days a week. So there's different levels of specificity. And all this is reflective of access to nature, now being seen as a social determinant of health. But now, of course, we have to ask the question, who has access to nature? And there's this organization called the Trust for Public Land, which is a major land protection organization that is really motivated by the idea of parks for people. And they put out this annual Park Score Index. And their index has revealed wide disparities in access. So for instance, 98% of residents in places like Washington, D.C. or Minneapolis or St. Paul are within a 10-minute walk to a park, compared to less than 50% of those in cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, Mesa, Arizona, and Oklahoma City. And even within cities, access to green spaces, just like access to healthy food or healthcare or good schools, this access is inequitable, with low-income households and people of color least likely to live close to parks with basic amenities like bathrooms or playgrounds or basketball court. I wanted to just illustrate this with this map from the Brookings Institute. The darker dots show metro areas in which a higher proportion of the population has access to park. The lighter dots, less of the population has 10-minute access to a park. Interestingly, you can see there's a cluster of less access in metro areas in the South. And I think that can't be disaggregated from that history that I just described. And I just want to wrap up this question with a quick anecdote about what this feels like for certain communities. So I used to work in Jackson at a conference that looked at this intersection between public lands, conservation, and health. And Jackson, if you haven't been there, is like this real hub for outdoor recreation on public lands. It's the Teton Mountain Range within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And the reason people come there and the reason people live there is because you have great access to healthy public lands and these really majestic landscapes. And one year I was working at this conference, and one of the keynote speakers was a woman my age. And her name was Janet Valenzuela. It is Janet Valenzuela. And what she said, and this still sticks with me, she said to the audience, who was all folks from Jackson Hole, when you talk about public lands, it means places like Yellowstone National Park or Grand Teton National Park, this amazing ecosystem that you live within. When my community of Huntington Park, California, which is a predominantly low-income Latino community, when we talk about public lands, it means going outside and smelling the toxic fumes from the meatpacking plant down the street. public lands mean we're not safe. And I illustrate this because Janet's experience is not unique. Reports like the Toxic Waste and Race report from Robert Bullard and other authors illustrate that statistically, low-income communities of color are more likely to live near toxic waste sites. And so this nature health interconnection that I described earlier in this answer is distributed inequitably among communities, and in certain communities, going outside can actually have a detrimental impact on health. So it's important to have the full context there in that response.
Right. I think it's hard. There's so much to unpack, and the obvious question coming to me is like, what do we do about this, right? And something I'm thinking about is, and you can apply this sort of framework to so many different social justice issues, but the idea that the responsibility of equity is not on the minority group, or that like disproportionately group that has disproportionate access to these areas, or like in any way you could define access. And so sort of thinking about allyship, but also just thinking about the dominant narrative around the outdoors then, given that what we talked about with held in nature and the history are the case. I'd like to unpack the idea of finding oneself in nature, or like this idea that the outdoors are cool, and how that perspective or narrative promoted in some ways from on the corporate level, like from Patagonia, but also in terms of development and green infrastructure being tied to increased gentrification in urban areas. Could you speak to the role of that narrative and give actionable steps for people who would want to be allies in terms of like breaking themselves out of that narrative, because I think it's one that a lot of people fall into, regardless of your background. The outdoors are cool, but in brushing it over as like the grand mysticism we ignore so much. So that was a large question, but if you could talk.
Totally, I'll break it into two parts. One about allyship, and the other in reference to your questions about gentrification.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's okay to go into nature to, quote, find yourself, whatever that looks like. I think we live in this culture that's increasingly self-conscious and electronic and automated and really inward focused. And if going outside breaks up these patterns of thought for you, I'm all for it. But I think it's important to recognize that we have to find a sustainable level of access between humans in the natural world, because not only can more people getting outside damage ecological health if not managed properly, but it can also exacerbate some of these in-group, out-group dynamics around outdoor recreation when there starts to be any competition for shared space. And so your question on allyship, when I am confronted by a question I don't always know the answer to, I turn to experts, and one expert is a woman named Danielle Williams at Melanin Base Camp. Melanin Base Camp is an affinity group for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color that works to dismantle systems that have excluded people from outdoor recreation on a racial basis. And she identifies 10 habits for effective allyship, and I just wanted to share a few that resonate with me. One is to just recognize that people experience the outdoors differently. There is no one way to have a meaningful experience outside. There are plenty of anecdotes of folks of color or from the LGBTQ community or disabled people receiving unwanted interactions based on their identity. I think of someone like Christian Cooper, the Black bird watcher in Central Park, who was accosted by a white woman after he asked her to leash her dog, which was what was like required there. Or the story about a Diné man. So the Diné tribe is part of the Navajo Nation. He was tased by a National Park Service officer in December at Petroglyph National Monument in New Mexico because he walked off trail to do prayers. There's been, of course, the rise in anti-Asian American Pacific Islander sentiment across the United States. All this is to say, if people have different experiences or seem a little less open or bought into this idea that nature is necessarily healing, that's okay. People have different experiences outside, and collectively, we need to acknowledge that that's cool. We also need, again, from Danielle, we need to recognize that the outdoors is not really detached from the rest of the world. It's not a neutral place because of this history I described earlier. So actually time outside can be a place to engage with some of the hard questions about race and privilege and belief systems, or interrupt microaggressions as you see them. And I really see the outdoors for me as a place where my leading edge of growth is. And I think it's also leading edge of growth around societal and systemic issues as a whole. And lastly, as allies, we can take on a supporting role in boosting organizations that are advocating for increased representation in the outdoors, and also kind of agitating at those places that hold the power. Danielle writes, consider the nonprofit or conservancy where you volunteer or is in your neighborhood. Is that leadership all white, able-bodied, middle to upper class, or are they mostly white, able-bodied, middle to upper class? What does the board look like? Does the organization partner with subject matter experts and grassroots leaders who identify as folks of color? The ideas or contributions of folks of color being valued, and why is that? And so for us, like local land trusts and environmental organizations that engage people in the outdoors are a great place to start. And Ashley, did you want to jump in here, or?
I'm happy to let you finish. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I just want to remind everyone that right after this answer, we're going to move to a Q&A section of the event. So if you haven't done so already, please pop your questions into the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them if you can. Chris, feel free to finish your thought. Didn't mean to interrupt you.
No,
Marie,
it's just
after that
fine.
point,
I wanted to just talk briefly about gentrification, which is an important question as we expand park access to people. I think it's really important to capture the big picture here, because building parks can bring a lot of benefits to communities and also unintended consequences. And I think if we let fear of gentrification prevent us from developing new parks in certain communities, we just perpetuate those park inequalities that have been described earlier. So in a very simple statement, our goal is to maximize the benefits that are shown here and minimize these unintended consequences. And just to bring in some research here, these London School of Economics researchers found that when building new parks, it's the function and location of these parks that are associated with gentrification. So for instance, linear parks with active transportation trails, like for walking or running or biking, are consistently linked to higher odds of gentrification within their surrounding neighborhoods. So a great or not so great example of this is like the Highline Park on the west side of Manhattan. This has been a very popular park for locals and visitors alike, but it's also really driven up the value of the nearby property. And so how do we prevent these unintended consequences? Well, according to experts, the best practices are to start early and think proactively about some of these challenges of gentrification that have faced other communities. Engage the community, so really promote procedural justice in the way that folks participate in envisioning what a park could look like, for whom and with what benefits. And to also think holistically. A park is not just a park, it's this nexus of housing policy and food systems and health all in one. And if we partner our efforts with existing initiatives that look at social determinants of health, we can hopefully prevent those unintended consequences of gentrification. I just want to exemplify this with a couple parks that I think have done this really well. The Kiwanis Metau Park in Wenatchee, Washington, and the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C. The anecdote that really sticks with me from the first is that the Trust for Public Land, who helped build this park, spent almost 3 years in the community just building trust, understanding needs of this predominantly Latino community. And during that time, over 500 residents participated in the visioning process to ensure that this new park would reflect the priorities of the community. So things like family gatherings and cultural festivals and community events. And neighbors agreed that the park needed this central kiosk called a kiosco to host gatherings and celebrations. And this is really reflective of many of the first and second generation Mexican families who reside in South Wenatchee. And the second park is the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, D.C., which plans to connect two neighborhoods with really disparate demographics and incomes. And The plan for this park is to be a hub for outdoor performance and playgrounds and urban agriculture, environmental education center, and similarly has really engaged the entire community in the planning. And among their outputs, they're talking about prioritizing the hiring of neighborhood residents for job opportunities. They want to advocate for equitable distribution of grants and educational programs. They want to sustain small businesses in the surrounding community, work with city agencies and existing nonprofits, et cetera. So illustrations of ways that park development can actually really incorporate community needs and, in fact, enhance existing efforts. So I just wanted to point those out. And maybe it's a good time for Q&A from the audience.
Yeah, so something you brought up is this idea of a park is not just a park. And there's a question here. I don't know if you've read the article. It's asking about David Truer's Atlantic article about returning national park land to indigenous control. And specifically the questions about your thoughts on the proposal, which I think ties really well to what you were just saying about Wenatchee, because I think something that came up for me at least was that it's good to have community input, but there's still this like incorporating community into the larger like white infrastructure. And so what are your thoughts on like actually shifting control and like how that would be done?
Yeah, so the concept of land back as it exists in that Atlantic article, it exists along a spectrum. And it's important that it does exist along a spectrum because of this legacy of decimation of tribes, certain tribes have more organizing capability and bandwidth now than others. And so there may be tribes who are very well suited to retain or have their stewardship rights restored to the land and have full control. And a great example of this is up in Maine, where recently the Elliottsville Foundation, which is a nonprofit, returned 700 acres to the Penobscot Nation for historic stewardship. And this tribe has the capability right now to steward the land effectively. There are other tribes that can get there. And in the meantime, there are plenty of ideas about co-management, shared stewardship, in which the tribe plays an active role in the visioning and stewardship of the land with the support of existing resources. And I think by looking long-term, like how would this look to give the tribe full management decades into the future? How can we get there? Starts with thinking creatively about maximizing existing resources and putting tribes at the front of the table to dictate those decisions. So I just want to point out that these efforts exist along a spectrum. I think in general, we have to be moving towards restoring stewardship to tribes. Some are just ready now and others will be ready because of that legacy of discrimination and decimation that exists.
Right. So I guess going back a little bit, we had another question about commodification of land and bodies as going hand in hand. And this person was interested in you're mentioning the use of expensive gear, which was really like a cool tidbit, I thought, and spaces that were curated to give a taste of wilderness rather than the wilderness itself. And so this participant is interested in how to decommodify the land in a way that promotes authentic and inclusive experience.
Boy, that's a huge question. I think it comes from the stories that we tell one another about how we relate to land. And in white communities, in outdoor rec oriented communities, there's a lot of conversation around accomplishments. Where did you go last weekend? What did you do? Whether it was a challenging rock climb or peak that you summited, and outdoor companies really lean into that narrative. They want to enable those sorts of experiences where their products, their expensive gear gets people to the top of the mountain or the climb or the bottom of the ski run. And so we need to shift those narratives, I think, about what sort of experiences are valued outdoors, so that the outdoors becomes this place that we engage with holistically, that we provide benefit to, that does not just provide benefit to us. And the companies that dictate those narratives need to be willing to tell different stories about how people engage with our public lands, not just the conquering and achievement, but also the sort of shared benefits to the land and to people alike. I don't know if that really answered the question, but those are my initial thoughts there.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before in terms of the company wanting to get people there and feeding in, like it's a self-generative cycle, I guess. And I think this will probably be our last question. And it's about park inequity. And what is your sense about the growing recognition about inequity in green spaces? And is this becoming more of a public health priority? And related, have there been instances where adding greenery promotes gentrification in the sense of adding grocery stores to reduce food deserts, for example?
Do you mind repeating that one more time? It felt like there were two questions.
The second part, there were two questions.
Yeah.
The first was about the growing recognition of inequity in green space access. And is this something that's becoming more of a public health priority, which I think you sort of talked about with prescriptions, but maybe in a more general sense, the person is wondering within
Can I answer that real quick?
Yeah.
I think every environmental institution in the United States has recognized that their mission does not exist in a vacuum from social justice issues, that environmental health and public health are intertwined. And I think, sadly, it took the last year and the murders of Black people to make organizations realize that. For instance, with the guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin yesterday, the Wilderness Society, which is perhaps the leading nonprofit on the protection of public lands, put out a statement basically just addressing the pain that the Black community is feeling, and that this is one small step towards restorative justice. And the Wilderness Society of 10 years ago would not have done that. So organizations are waking up to this inequity, and they're increasingly starting to incorporate it into their mission, some more effectively than others, but there is progress. And the second question, Marie?
The second question was going to talk more about gentrification, specifically talking about adding grocery stores to reduce food deserts and how that might lead to gentrification, if that's like something that's been happening, I guess is the question.
It probably is. I am not an expert on gentrification, grocery stores, parks, new small businesses are all aspects of that. But I would rather not speak on something I just don't know specific data about.
Yeah.
That's certainly part of the puzzle.
That makes sense. Well, that's our last question. Ashley?
Yeah, we are right at time. So on behalf of Yale Sustainability, I extend my thanks to you, Chris, for sharing your expertise today, and to Marie for being such a solid interviewer and really inviting the community into this conversation. If you in the audience love this conversation, we have 2 more on each remaining day of Earth Week. Feel free to register for future live explainers on our website and explore our calendar of events and library of opportunities for learning and action on earthweek.yale.edu. Thanks so much for joining us.